In the spring of 1999, a junior analyst at a federal records facility outside Washington noticed something that did not make sense. It was not dramatic. No alarms went off. No red warning banner flashed across the screen. It was a quiet inconsistency, exactly the kind that usually disappeared after a second look. An American passport number, issued in 1958, had survived every verification process for more than 4 decades. It had been renewed. It had been cross-checked. It had passed border entries, background screenings, tax filings, and Social Security confirmations. On paper, it belonged to a man who had lived in Orlando, Florida, since the early 1960s. But when the analyst traced the passport back to its origin, something was missing. There was no birth record, no hospital entry, no county ledger, no delayed registration, no church baptism filed retroactively. The name existed everywhere after 1958 and nowhere before it. At first, the assumption was clerical loss. Fires happened. Records vanished. Counties flooded. But this absence was too clean. Even disasters left fragments. This left nothing. The man attached to the passport was not important. He had never held public office. He had no criminal record. He had never appeared on a watch list. He lived in a modest home, paid his taxes early, and volunteered twice a month at a local veteran charity, despite never serving himself. If the system had a definition of harmless, he fit it perfectly. That was precisely the problem. Because this passport had already passed 2 FBI background reviews. Once during a Cold War counterintelligence sweep in the 1970s, and again in the mid-1980s when internal security standards tightened after a series of espionage scandals. Both times, his file had closed cleanly. No flags. No follow-up. And yet, here it was. A man legally American, administratively invisible before adulthood. The analyst escalated the anomaly, not because it suggested espionage, but because it violated logic. Federal systems were designed to fail loudly. This one had failed silently. The Orlando address attached to the passport led to a quiet neighborhood built in the optimism of post-war America. Palm trees, identical driveways, lawns trimmed to regulation height. The man had lived there for nearly 20 years. Same house, same routine, same unremarkable presence. Neighbors described him with the same words, repeated almost verbatim. Polite, private, dependable. He waved. He listened more than he spoke. He never argued politics. When federal agents later reviewed the footage from his passport renewal interview in the 1980s, they saw nothing unusual. His answers were concise. His eye contact was natural. His accent, if there ever had been one, was gone. He did not over-explain. He did not hesitate. He behaved like someone who had nothing to hide. What the system could not see was that this passport had not fooled the FBI by being exceptional. It had fooled the FBI by being ordinary. In the late 1950s, American passport issuance relied on trust. Trust in affidavits. Trust in witnesses. Trust in paper. It was assumed that no one would attempt to build an identity from nothing and then spend decades protecting it through patience and restraint. This man did exactly that. He did not chase influence. He did not seek access. He did not rush his mission. He waited. By the time the Cold War ended, the passport had outlived the country that created the man behind it. The handlers were gone. The networks dissolved. The ideology that had justified the deception collapsed under its own weight. Only the lie remained. And it remained so intact that even the most advanced federal databases of the late 20th century had accepted it as truth. Until one person asked a question no one had asked before. Who issues a passport to someone who was never born? That question would take investigators back more than 40 years, across borders that no longer existed, into a system that understood something the modern world had forgotten. The most effective cover is not invisibility. It is normality. 18 months before the passport was issued, the man who would later become American sat in a concrete basement beneath a municipal records building in Eastern Europe. The city itself was unremarkable, important enough to justify bureaucracy, insignificant enough to escape attention. That was why it had been chosen. His real name was not classified, but it was never meant to travel. In the early 1950s, names were tools. They were issued, withdrawn, and discarded as circumstances required. He had grown up in a border region where maps changed more often than street signs, where identity was something inherited cautiously and revealed selectively. He was not recruited for charisma. He was selected for temperament. Psychological assessments conducted by Soviet intelligence during that period favored men who showed patience without passivity, intelligence without ambition, and emotional restraint without detachment. He had survived a war without heroics, learned 2 foreign languages without fluency gaps, and displayed a rare ability to absorb routine without resentment. In other words, he could disappear inside a life. The basement room held no symbols. No flags, no slogans, just a table, a lamp, and 3 men who never introduced themselves. The process they oversaw was not dramatic. It was administrative. Forging a convincing American identity in the 1950s was not about technical brilliance. It was about historical accuracy. The Soviets understood this well. They did not invent exceptional Americans. They invented forgettable ones. The identity they built for him began with a premise that could not be disproven easily: a home birth in rural America during the late 1930s. At the time, thousands of births went unregistered or were recorded years later. Midwives operated informally. County clerks relied on handwritten ledgers vulnerable to error, loss, and fire. The planners studied American demography the way anthropologists study tribes. They chose a state with decentralized records, a county with known archival gaps, a town small enough to avoid scrutiny, but large enough to exist in federal systems. The name was selected last. It was ordinary, unmemorable, and statistically common for the period. Not popular enough to cluster. Not rare enough to stand out. They tested it against immigration rolls, military drafts, school registries. It produced no collisions. Then came the paper. The passport itself would not be forged overseas. That was a critical decision. Instead, they constructed supporting documents that would survive domestic verification. Affidavits, employment letters, a baptismal note written on aged paper using the correct regional phrasing. Everything was designed to age naturally. The man watched as his future life was assembled in folders, each document slightly imperfect by design. Dates misaligned by days, not years. Ink faded unevenly. Nothing too clean. Nothing too precise. When he asked, once, what would happen if the Americans discovered the fabrication, one of the men answered without looking up. They will not, he said. They will verify that the papers agree with each other. They will not ask why they exist. The training that followed was brief and surgical. He learned what to forget as much as what to remember. He was instructed never to volunteer details, never to correct assumptions, never to appear grateful. Above all, he was taught to avoid patterns. Real Americans contradicted themselves. They misremembered dates. They confused geography. Perfection attracted suspicion. Imperfection blended in. By the time the passport application was prepared, the man had already stopped thinking of the identity as false. That was intentional. The mind could not protect what it rejected. In 1958, the documents were placed into the system through channels that exploited bureaucratic overload, not corruption. No bribes were paid. No officials were compromised. The application passed because it resembled thousands of others processed that week. When the passport was approved, no celebration followed. There was no handshake, no congratulation, just a quiet instruction delivered with finality. You will not return, one of the men said. If you do, you will not be recognized. The man understood what that meant. The country that had shaped him had already begun erasing him. Weeks later, standing in a European airport with a U.S. passport in his coat pocket, he experienced something unexpected. Not fear, but relief. For the first time, his survival no longer depended on allegiance. It depended on consistency. As the plane lifted toward the Atlantic, the name printed inside the passport became his only inheritance. He did not practice it aloud. He did not test it in his mouth. He simply waited, because the success of the operation no longer belonged to Moscow. It belonged to the system that would decide whether a man could exist without ever having been born. When a man entered the United States for the first time in late 1958, nothing about the moment marked it as significant. There was no secondary inspection, no prolonged questioning, no quiet signal passed between officers. His passport was examined, stamped, and returned with the casual efficiency of a system designed to move people through, not stop them. That, more than anything else, was the first success. During the Cold War, the FBI did not operate as an omniscient dragnet. It functioned as a reactive institution constrained by paper, manpower, and prioritization. Resources were focused on known threats, defectors, embassy personnel, scientists, activists. A man arriving with a valid American passport did not fit any risk profile that justified attention. From the Bureau's perspective, Americans did not need to be screened at the border. They had already been vetted. What the FBI did not fully account for was how fragile that initial vetting was. In the 1950s, passport verification relied on internal consistency, not external proof. If the affidavits aligned, if the name cleared existing indexes, if no duplicate surfaced, the system assumed legitimacy. There was no national birth database to consult. County records were not digitized. Cross-state verification was slow and often incomplete. The man understood none of this at the time. He only knew what he had been taught. Behave like someone who expects to belong. He chose Orlando deliberately. Florida in the early 1960s was growing faster than its institutions could adapt. New residents arrived daily from across the country. Retirees, construction workers, defense contractors, families chasing climate and opportunity. Transients created anonymity. Anonymity created safety. He rented first, then bought modestly. He took work that required reliability, not visibility. He filed tax returns early. He avoided debt. He never applied for positions that demanded deep background checks. Most importantly, he avoided proximity to ideology. The FBI's counterintelligence operations during this period were not random. They were targeted. Surveillance followed patterns. Foreign accents in sensitive industries, unexplained wealth, political agitation, frequent travel behind the Iron Curtain. He triggered none of them. When the Bureau conducted a regional background sweep in the early 1970s, prompted by heightened concern over long-term illegals, his name appeared only incidentally. A routine check tied to employment verification. The agents reviewing his file saw a coherent life. Marriage certificate, mortgage history, utility records, references from neighbors who described him as quiet and dependable. Nothing suggested duplicity. What no file could show was the discipline behind that normalcy. He never spoke about childhood beyond vague statements. He redirected personal questions with practiced humility. He let others fill in the blanks, then accepted their assumptions as fact. Over time, even he forgot which memories were borrowed and which were real. By the 1980s, the FBI had improved its internal coordination, but it was still limited by legacy data. When another security tightening occurred following high-profile espionage cases, his passport was reviewed again. Once more it passed. The document was not impressive. It did not need to be. It was old enough to be unquestioned and renewed often enough to remain active. Age, in this case, functioned as validation. To investigators, longevity implied legitimacy. What they did not consider was that the most effective deception was one that demanded nothing. He did not seek access to secrets. He did not transmit information regularly. His value lay in patience, not productivity. Years passed. Administrations changed. Threat models evolved. The Cold War hardened, then softened, then drifted toward conclusion. Through it all, the man remained exactly where he had placed himself, in the margins of importance. The FBI did not fail because it was careless. It failed because it was rational. There was no reason to look closer. And so the passport endured, not by exploiting weakness, but by aligning perfectly with expectation. By the time the Bureau began transitioning toward digital records, the man's existence had already been normalized beyond suspicion. He was no longer a question. He was a constant. That was the danger. Because systems built to detect deviation are blind to what never deviates. And in Orlando, the most invisible man in America had spent 20 years proving that nothing attracts less attention than a life lived exactly as expected. By the mid-1960s, the man understood something his instructors had only implied. Survival in America was not about secrecy. It was about performance. Not the loud kind, not the theatrical kind, but the daily, unconscious performance of belonging. He studied Americans the way a linguist studied dialects, not through books or radio, but through proximity. He listened at grocery counters, in barber shops, in waiting rooms. He observed how men complained without anger, how they joked without intimacy, how they spoke about the government with casual contradiction. None of it was rehearsed. That was the point. Americans contradicted themselves freely. They forgot dates. They misremembered events. They exaggerated stories without caring whether they were believed. Consistency was not a virtue. Comfort was. He learned to be comfortably imprecise. When asked where he was from, he answered with a region, not a town. When asked about childhood, he mentioned weather, not people. He adopted a mild accent that suggested movement rather than origin, something shaped by travel, not birth. Over time, it softened into neutrality. The most difficult adjustment was emotional, not behavioral. In the country he had left behind, discretion was survival. Silence was safety. In America, silence attracted attention. People expected disclosure, not confession, but participation. He had to learn when to speak, when to interrupt, when to offer opinion without conviction. The moment he realized he was succeeding came unexpectedly. It was a civic duty, jury summons. He had feared it. Federal forms carried risk. But the process was ordinary, almost careless. He was dismissed without question. He walked out of the courthouse with a strange sense of validation. The system had not merely accepted him, it had assumed him. Shortly after, he married. The decision was not part of any instruction. It was necessity, but not calculation. The woman he chose was American by every definition the system respected. Born locally, documented deeply, socially embedded. She did not marry him out of passion or suspicion. She married him because he was stable, attentive, and undemanding. That, too, was a form of camouflage. Marriage created witnesses. It anchored him to timelines and obligations. It produced paperwork that reinforced itself. Tax filings, insurance, shared addresses. The deeper he integrated, the harder it became for the system to imagine him as an anomaly. But the marriage also introduced risk. Intimacy required memory. Spouses noticed gaps. They asked about parents, siblings, traditions. He answered honestly where he could, evasively where he could not. He never lied aggressively. He allowed misunderstandings to settle naturally. Over time, the woman filled in the story herself. That was the most dangerous phase, when the lie no longer required effort. He watched American news obsessively, not for ideology, but for rhythm. He learned when outrage mattered and when it faded. He learned that attention moved quickly and memory decayed faster. He learned that trust in systems was assumed, not earned. When he voted for the first time, he felt no triumph, only a quiet unease. Participation deepened the role. Every action tied him tighter to a name that was never his. And yet, something unexpected happened. The performance stopped feeling like performance. He developed preferences he had never planned. He cared about local issues. He argued mildly about taxes. He complained about traffic. These were not strategic behaviors. They were reflexes that frightened him more than discovery ever had. Because the danger was no longer exposure. It was assimilation. The FBI, during this period, remained distant and abstract, an institution that existed on television and in rumors. He encountered it only once, indirectly, when a neighbor mentioned working in federal law enforcement. He adjusted nothing. No sudden caution. No withdrawal. He had learned that fear changed behavior, and behavior attracted attention. So he remained exactly the same. By the end of the decade, the man had crossed a line no document could record. He no longer thought of himself as living undercover. He thought of himself as living. The passport had not just given him access to America. It had given him permission to forget who he had been before. And that forgetting, slow, involuntary, irreversible, was the true success of the operation. Because a man who no longer remembers the truth has nothing left to conceal. By the early 1970s, the man's life in Orlando had settled into something the system trusted instinctively: predictability. He left for work at the same time each morning. He returned before dark. Weekends followed patterns that never changed. Groceries on Saturday. Yard work on Sunday. Occasional dinners with neighbors who knew him well enough to rely on him, but not well enough to study him. Predictability was not laziness. It was discipline. He understood that ambition created records, and records invited questions. So he chose a career path that rewarded steadiness rather than advancement. His supervisors described him as reliable, not innovative, not difficult, the kind of employee who made systems function quietly in the background. The FBI had a word for people like him, though they rarely applied it domestically: low signal. Low signal individuals generated no actionable data, no anomalies, no extremes. They were the statistical noise of society, and they passed through investigative models without triggering thresholds. When counterintelligence priorities intensified during the mid-1970s, Orlando was not ignored. Florida housed defense contractors, military installations, and growing aerospace industries. The Bureau expanded informant networks and conducted broad community-level assessments. The man noticed none of this directly. He did not need to. His insulation came from normalcy, not ignorance. He had learned something crucial. Scrutiny followed proximity to power. He avoided it entirely. His marriage endured without drama. That, too, was intentional, though not artificial. Conflict produced witnesses. Stability discouraged attention. They argued privately, resolved quietly, and never involved outsiders. To the community, they appeared unremarkable in the most reassuring way. Children came next. This was the phase he had never been trained for. Parenthood introduced a new vulnerability, not legal but emotional. Children asked questions without motive. They noticed inconsistencies without judgment. They demanded stories. He gave them fragments, anecdotes detached from place, lessons framed as advice rather than memory. Over time, the children constructed a past for him that felt complete enough to satisfy curiosity. He allowed it. What he could not allow was sentimentality. Nostalgia was dangerous. It tempted elaboration. It encouraged detail. He kept his emotional range narrow and controlled, even at home. During this period, his contact with his original handlers diminished. Communication had always been sparse, but now it became irregular. Instructions arrived infrequently, then not at all. He did not inquire. Silence in intelligence work often meant survival. The FBI, meanwhile, continued its work methodically. Background checks occurred when his employer changed contracts. Credit reviews surfaced during refinancing. Each time, the same result emerged: coherence. His passport, renewed again in the late 1970s, carried the weight of history. It had aged into legitimacy. Documents that survived that long were rarely questioned. Longevity itself functioned as evidence. Agents reviewing his file were not negligent. They were efficient. Efficiency meant trusting the absence of contradiction. One detail, however, remained constant and unnoticed. The man never traveled internationally. Not once. He claimed disinterest, expense, obligation. No one challenged it. In truth, he feared the margin. Borders were where systems compared notes, where assumptions thinned. He had no need to test his cover unnecessarily. Everything he needed existed within a 50-mile radius. As the Cold War entered its late phase, attention shifted toward technology, cyber intrusion, and high-level penetration. The idea that a foreign asset would invest decades living quietly in Central Florida seemed implausible to analysts focused on speed and impact. That miscalculation protected him. He was not collecting secrets. He was collecting time. And time did something neither side had anticipated. It changed him. He stopped thinking in terms of missions. He stopped measuring success by invisibility. He began measuring it by continuity. His children's schedules, his wife's expectations, his own aging body. The man who had arrived with a borrowed name now carried responsibilities that felt heavier than allegiance ever had. By the end of the 1970s, the operation, if it could still be called that, had succeeded beyond its original purpose. The asset had not just embedded. He had rooted. And roots, once established, were harder to remove than any foreign agent the FBI knew how to find. Because you cannot extract what no longer considers itself foreign. The closest the FBI ever came to uncovering him did not begin with suspicion. It began with paperwork. In the early 1980s, a routine federal contracting audit expanded its scope. New counterintelligence guidelines, shaped by recent espionage cases, required deeper background validation for anyone working in proximity to sensitive infrastructure, even indirectly. The man's employer was reclassified under those rules, and every long-term employee was flagged for review. The notice arrived in the mail. Neutral language. No urgency. A request to confirm identity, residence history, and citizenship status. He read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it on the kitchen table. There was no panic. Panic produced errors. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments were the ones that felt ordinary. The FBI interview took place in a nondescript federal office. No recording equipment in sight. No two-way mirror. Two agents. One older, one younger. The dynamic was intentional. Authority balanced with curiosity. They did not accuse. They asked, "Where were you born? How long have you lived in Florida? Have you ever held a foreign passport?" He answered each question without elaboration. His responses were neither defensive nor helpful. They were adequate. The agents watched not for facts, but for behavior. Stress indicators. Inconsistencies. Overcorrection. He gave them none. He spoke slowly, but not carefully. He corrected himself once, on a minor date, and then dismissed it with a casual shrug. That mattered. People lying about important things avoided correction. People telling the truth corrected themselves without concern. The agents noted it subconsciously. At one point, the younger agent asked a question that was not on the form. "Do you still have family where you grew up?" The man paused. Not long enough to appear hesitant. Just long enough to acknowledge the weight of the question. "Not anymore," he said. It was true, in every way that mattered. The interview ended without conclusion. That, too, was intentional. The Bureau rarely resolved matters in the room. Resolution happened later, through files. His passport was reviewed again. By then, it was more than 20 years old. It had been renewed multiple times. It matched every federal index it touched. The absence of early records was noted, but explained away by historical gaps that were well documented and common for the era. No anomaly rose above threshold. The agents closed the review with a neutral notation. No action required. What neither of them knew was that the man had walked out of that building with a different realization than any he had carried before. The FBI was not hunting him. The FBI did not see him. That knowledge altered the balance of fear. Until that moment, he had lived cautiously because he believed discovery was always possible. Now he understood that the system's confidence in itself was his greatest shield. He returned home and resumed his routine without adjustment. That was the most important step. Behavioral continuity reinforced the outcome. Any sudden change, withdrawal, agitation, excessive normalcy, could retroactively raise questions. Instead, he did nothing. In the years that followed, global events shifted dramatically. The ideological tension that had defined his original purpose began to erode. Summits replaced standoffs. Rhetoric softened. Intelligence priorities evolved. His handlers never contacted him again. At first, he waited. Then he stopped waiting. By the time the Cold War formally ended, the life he had built no longer felt borrowed. It felt earned. He had paid for it with vigilance, restraint, and time. But beneath that stability was a quiet paradox. The FBI's closest approach had not exposed him. It had liberated him. Because once a system decides you're unremarkable, it stops looking, not just at you, but through you. And that meant the greatest risk was no longer the Bureau. It was what would happen if the past, long ignored, suddenly became relevant again. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not arrive in Orlando with sirens or announcements. It appeared on television screens, between commercials, framed by commentators who spoke in abstractions. Borders shifted, flags changed, an empire dissolved in real time. For the man, it felt less like an ending than an erasure. The country that had given him purpose no longer existed. The institutions that had trained him, monitored him, and defined his risk had either vanished or reinvented themselves. Whatever file once bore his real name was now buried beneath reorganizations, purges, and bureaucratic decay. He did not celebrate. He did not mourn. He felt unmoored. For decades, his life had been structured around an unspoken understanding. There was a reason for the lie. That reason had justified the vigilance, the restraint, the emotional distance. With the ideological conflict gone, the lie remained, but its purpose did not. He was free in the most unsettling sense of the word. No one would extract him. No one would reward him. No one would debrief him. He was not a hero abandoned. He was an asset rendered obsolete by history. At home, nothing changed outwardly. His children entered adulthood. They spoke about careers, relationships, futures that assumed permanence. They treated his presence as guaranteed, not conditional. That assumption frightened him. For the first time, he considered the possibility that the lie might end not through exposure, but through confession. Not because of guilt, but because of exhaustion. Carrying a false origin required constant subtraction, stories withheld, emotions restrained, truths filtered. But confession was not an act of courage. It was an act of destruction. The system might forgive him. His family would not understand him. Identity, once shared, could not be retracted. At the federal level, priorities shifted rapidly. Counterintelligence resources were reallocated. Attention turned toward emerging threats that moved faster and left digital traces. Long-term, human-based infiltration seemed antiquated by comparison. The man benefited from that assumption. He remained careful, but less so. He allowed himself minor indulgences, stronger opinions, sharper disagreements. He traveled domestically. He spoke more freely about the present, less about the past. He believed, briefly, that the danger had passed. What he did not account for was the nature of institutional memory. As agencies modernized, they began digitizing, not to hunt old enemies, but to clean systems. Legacy records were converted into databases. Discrepancies were tolerated less, not because of suspicion, but because algorithms required resolution. Machines did not understand historical context. They understood absence. The man sensed the change before it reached him. Forms became longer. Identity verification more layered. Questions once ignored resurfaced with clinical neutrality. Date of birth. Place of birth. Parentage. Each field carried the same assumption. That truth was fixed and retrievable. He answered carefully, but for the first time in decades, he felt the margin narrowing. At night, he thought about the country he had left behind, not as a homeland, but as a shadow. It could no longer protect him, but it could still implicate him. The disappearance of the Soviet system had not erased the records. It had simply scattered them, and scattered things had a way of resurfacing. The most unsettling realization came quietly. He was no longer afraid of the FBI. He was afraid of systems with no memory, no intuition, and no capacity for discretion. Because people could be convinced. Databases could not. By the mid-1990s, the lie had outlived its creators, its purpose, and its geopolitical context. It existed now as a technical artifact, an error waiting to be reconciled. And when systems reconcile errors, they do not ask why the error made sense at the time. They only ask why it exists. That question was already forming somewhere he could not see. And when it surfaced, it would not arrive with confrontation. It would arrive as a notification, a mismatch, a quiet alert in a system designed to correct the past without understanding it. The alert did not announce itself as a threat. It appeared as a line item in a workflow queue during a federal records modernization project, one of thousands generated each week as legacy files were converted into unified digital systems. Its label was clinical, record inconsistency, origin unverified. To the system, the man's passport was not suspicious. It was incomplete. The algorithm had no concept of midwives, rural registries, or paper affidavits. It compared inputs. Birth date matched nothing. Location produced no corroborating entry. Parent names returned null. The passport had survived for decades because no one had ever asked all those questions at once. Now a machine had. The case was routed to a small interagency review group tasked with resolving historical anomalies. Most were mundane, typographical errors, duplicate names, outdated formats. This one was different. It did not contradict itself. It simply lacked an origin. A junior analyst in Orlando noticed the pattern. She had been trained to distrust outliers, not because they implied wrongdoing, but because they disrupted system integrity. Her role was not investigative. It was corrective. She pulled the file. What she saw was a life fully formed from the age of 20 onward. Employment records, tax filings, property ownership, family connections. No gaps, no irregularities. The problem was not what existed. It was what had not. She escalated the file, not with urgency, but with curiosity. The request moved upward, acquiring marginal annotations as it went. Verify source. Confirm birthplace. Locate primary documentation. Each step assumed the next would resolve it. None did. The inquiry reached a unit that still retained institutional memory. Analysts who understood the Cold War not as history, but as lived experience. They recognized the pattern immediately, though they did not say it aloud. Long-term illegals left shadows like this. But recognition did not equal accusation. The man learned of the review indirectly. A notice requesting additional documentation arrived by mail, framed as routine identity reconciliation. No deadline, no threat, just a request. He read it slowly. For the first time since arriving in America, there was nothing he could submit that would reinforce the lie. Every document he possessed depended on the same foundational assumption. There was no deeper layer to reach for. He considered non-compliance. It would attract attention. He considered explanation. It would create a narrative where none existed. He chose the only option he had ever trusted. He responded minimally. Weeks passed, then months. The review deepened quietly. Analysts compared handwriting on affidavits. They traced witnesses long deceased. They examined issuance practices from an era when trust substituted for verification. They found no forgery. That unsettled them, because it suggested something more deliberate than fraud. When the case was reassigned to a field office, the tone changed. The objective was no longer correction. It was understanding. Two agents reviewed the file late one evening, long after their shift had ended. They did not speak much. They did not need to. The man had done nothing wrong in decades. That was precisely what made him interesting. They requested an interview. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. Plain envelope. No insignia. No language of compulsion. He felt no panic. Only inevitability. He understood now that the system was not accusing him. It was reconciling itself. His life represented a contradiction it could no longer tolerate. On the morning of the interview, he dressed carefully, not formally, not casually. He chose the version of himself the system knew best. As he drove to the federal building, he thought about how long the passport had lasted, how many hands it had passed through, how many assumptions it had satisfied. It had not fooled the FBI through cleverness. It had fooled the FBI by existing long enough to become infrastructure. But infrastructure, once digitized, was no longer protected by habit or discretion. It was protected only by data. And data, once compared, had no patience for men who had never been born. By the time he parked his car, the question was no longer whether the truth would surface. It was how much of it the system would decide it needed. He said, the interview room was unremarkable. Standard gray walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a fluorescent light that hummed quietly. There was no dramatic reveal, no armed agents, no confrontation, just routine procedure. That, in itself, was unsettling. Two agents entered. One, older and measured, carried a folder. The other, younger, typed notes on a laptop. They did not introduce themselves with fanfare. They did not accuse. They did not explain why he was there. Their questions were procedural, almost indifferent. Date of birth, the older agent said. Place of birth, the younger added. He gave answers that aligned with the paperwork. Nothing more. Then came the crucial moment. Do you know why you're here? The older agent asked, leaning slightly forward. His tone was conversational, almost neutral. He did not flinch. He had anticipated this question for decades in theory, but never imagined its delivery would feel so mundane. Yes, he said quietly. I have a passport that exists because it was created for someone who did not legally exist. Silence followed. Neither agent reacted immediately. They were trained to remain neutral, to evaluate the facts without judgment. In the absence of drama, the truth itself becomes conspicuous. Explain, the older agent prompted. He did calmly, methodically. He spoke of the early Cold War, the operation that had built his identity, the reasoning behind the choice of documents and dates. He explained how he had lived quietly, integrated into society, avoided risk, and maintained a profile so unremarkable it had passed every scrutiny for decades. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He offered context and chronology only. The younger agent typed continuously. The older agent occasionally nodded, occasionally paused to cross-reference notes. After nearly an hour, he finished. He did not apologize. He did not plead. He had lived long enough to understand that justification was irrelevant. Survival did not require approval. It required explanation. The agents left the room to consult. He waited, seated, silent, a quiet observer of his own fate. Minutes stretched, not tense but deliberate. When they returned, there were no handcuffs, no warrants, no threats. You will not be prosecuted, the older agent said finally. Legally, nothing can be done. National security concerns from that era no longer apply. And your integration into society is complete. You have performed your cover exceptionally well. He nodded, acknowledging both relief and the subtle weight of what had transpired. This was not triumph. This was quiet closure. The agents explained that the file would be classified, that the passport would be canceled quietly, that no public record would associate the original identity with him. Essentially, he would remain who he had become, but the infrastructure supporting his false origin would be retired. His family would learn the truth gradually, if at all. He would not need to fabricate stories anymore, but the history behind those stories would remain classified, inaccessible to them. What he carried out of that room was not freedom, strictly speaking. It was reconciliation. He no longer had to maintain the tension of being discovered, but he would always carry the psychological residue of a life lived in parallel. Two identities layered over each other for decades. In the weeks that followed, he revisited the idea of identity. He realized that the man the world knew, the man who voted, filed taxes, raised children, and contributed quietly to his community, was no less real than the man created in the shadows of Cold War bureaucracy. The agent's words had confirmed one thing. The lie had not destroyed him. It had, paradoxically, allowed him to live more authentically than any of his original identity ever would have permitted. The operation had ended, but its imprint remained. He could not undo decades of adaptation, restraint, and habit. He could not erase the psychological discipline that had shaped him into someone so quietly meticulous that the world overlooked him entirely. And in that silence, he understood the deepest irony. The passport had never fooled the FBI because it was clever. It had fooled them because he had become convincingly, irreversibly normal. A man who did not exist legally had spent decades teaching an entire system to assume he did. When he returned home that evening, he opened his door, greeted his family, and walked through a life that was, at last, entirely his own. The agents would file their report, the databases would reconcile, and the Cold War would fade further into history. But in his mind, he would always carry the quiet proof. Invisibility achieved not through deception alone, but through the careful cultivation of ordinariness. No confrontation, no arrest, no fireworks, only the subtle, enduring victory of having lived undetected, and now, having survived revelation with dignity intact. After the interview, life resumed in its quiet, ordinary rhythm, but nothing was entirely the same. The government had canceled the original passport, the file had been classified, and the digital record that had once threatened exposure was now stored in secure archives. To the outside world, nothing had changed. To him, everything had. The man continued living in Orlando. His neighborhood, the palm-lined streets, and familiar sidewalks remained unchanged. Children still rode bicycles, neighbors still waved from driveways, the grocery store clerk still greeted him by name. In many ways, the ordinary world had accepted him, just as the system had. But internally, he carried a subtle recalibration. Every action, every word, now existed without the pretense of cover. He could speak freely, express opinions, and even explore his past, cautiously, with his family. They understood, little by little, that the life they thought they knew had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances hidden beneath decades of quiet normalcy. The paradox of his existence struck him most clearly at home. The family he had built, the marriage, the children, the friendships, was authentic. Yet the foundation upon which it rested had never existed legally. His real identity was a ghost, carefully erased and buried in bureaucratic obscurity. The man he had become was now the only real one. Occasionally, he reflected on the operations that had brought him here. The Soviet planners who had forged his identity, the meticulous paperwork, the painstaking instructions, all of it had aimed to create a man invisible yet effective. And for 20 years, he had succeeded beyond any calculation. He had not transmitted secrets or influenced policy. His value had been in endurance, patience, and assimilation. The FBI had been close only once, but even that encounter was procedural, almost mundane. Their failure to detect him in the decades prior had not been a testament to oversight. It was a testament to his discipline. He had not been extraordinary in skill or audacity. He had been extraordinary in restraint. The passport, now filed away permanently, became a symbol rather than a tool. It was proof that systems, even powerful federal ones, could be outmaneuvered by patience, normalcy, and human psychology. That same system, once poised to question him, now recognized him only as the citizen he had become. There was no celebration, no public acknowledgement. The story, for all its intrigue, remained classified, locked behind codes, and archived in silence. Yet for him, that secrecy was a form of respect. His life had been preserved not by luck, but by subtlety. Sometimes he thought about the children he never had the opportunity to truly explain things to. Questions they had asked decades earlier about origins and ancestry had been answered in fragments and half-truths. Now, he could answer more fully, but selectively. Certain details could never be shared. Others, he revealed slowly, trusting that understanding would grow without exposing the vulnerabilities that had once defined him. The psychological weight of decades-long deception never disappeared entirely. It lingered in the quiet moments, when he looked at old photographs, revisited documents, or reflected on the small choices that had kept him hidden. But that weight had transformed from fear into awareness, a constant reminder of how a life built carefully, deliberately, and invisibly could endure against the odds. The man who had arrived in America with a borrowed name, a false origin, and no legal existence had not only survived, he had thrived. His life was ordinary in appearance, yet extraordinary in its preservation. It was a life that had tested the limits of systems, the patience of human agencies, and the resilience of identity itself. In the end, the passport rested in a vault, a silent artifact of a Cold War operation that had outlived both its creators and its geopolitical context. The man lived on, fully present in his community, fully integrated in his family, fully himself. The lesson was quiet but profound. The most effective operations are not those that attract attention, nor those that win battles in dramatic displays. The most effective are the ones that endure, unseen, through patience, discipline, and the simple art of blending in. And in Orlando, decades after a Cold War identity had been forged, nothing betrayed the extraordinary truth that had existed quietly behind ordinary eyes. A man who had never been born legally had, against every expectation, become real. The passport filed away. The system reconciled. The life lived. The operation was over. But the story, his story, would endure silently in every subtle gesture of normalcy, in every measured decision, in every quiet, unremarkable moment of survival that had made him, paradoxically, unforgettable. After decades of living a life that was both fabricated and real, the man finally faced the quiet truth. Survival sometimes depends not on daring acts, but on patience, discipline, and blending in. He had fooled one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world, not through brilliance or force, but through ordinariness. It raises a question for all of us. How far would you go to protect your identity? And what would you give up to survive undetected? If this story fascinated you, don't forget to hit like, share, and comment. I want to know what you think. Could you live an entire life in someone else's name and keep it secret?